Good to go.
Welcome back to Senate Education, Wednesday, February 8th, 2:30. Mr. Fisher, thank you for joining us. As we mentioned at the start of committee, everyone has received the press release from the agency and knows a little bit about what has happened and what continues to happen. But we are immensely grateful for your willingness to come in and give us an update. So with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you. For the record, Ted Fisher, Vermont Agency of Education. I'm the agency's Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs. So what we know, I should just note up front, my colleague from the governor's office, Dee Barbic, the governor's violence prevention director, may or may not come in and join us. If that's okay. So I might, if she joins us, I might pass the mic to her. She's trying to wrap up the meeting. So between what we know is that between 08:30 and 1100 this morning, approximately 21 Vermont law enforcement agencies received calls reporting active shooter situations at local area schools.
How many?
21.
Thank you.
None of these calls were determined to be legitimate. I should actually just note, it was 20 to dispatch centers, and I'll go into that in a minute, and 1 to a town hall. And that is in a community where there is not a dispatch center located in the community. None of these calls were determined to be legitimate. The characteristics of the calls are similar and appear to be part of a hoax threat scam. It's unknown who the perpetrators are at this point and how exactly the hoax was conducted. The incident is under active investigation. You may hear me say that a couple of times in terms of questions that we can and cannot answer at this point. The calls were received to the main non-emergency line of dispatch centers, not to the 911 line. And as I mentioned, one call was received to a town hall, I presume to their main number. The governor's office is working with the Agency of Education, the Department of Public Safety, local law enforcement, school districts, and other community partners to respond to this incident and to investigate it. The Vermont School Safety Center was immediately in touch with Vermont school leaders, agency leadership at my agency and at the Department of Public Safety, as well as with the governor's office. And we worked quickly to get information out to Vermont schools and to the public about the incident. AOE sent a notice to superintendents and independent school heads and principals as well, excuse me. The Department of Public Safety sent out an immediate press release, and then there was a press conference at noon. I'm giving a poor and abridged version of that, so I recommend at very least watching the sort of briefing portion of it. Commissioner Morrison did a really good job sort of outlining all of the facts. And so that can be found on the governor's Facebook page if you're interested in referencing it later today. So every threat was taken seriously until it was determined to be a hoax. So that means there was a law enforcement response. Many students, staff, and families were also made aware of the situation as schools followed their emergency plans. So to that note, incidents like this can cause a lot of disruption and anxiety in our schools, emphasizing the need for a trauma-informed response and for schools to be available to their students, staff, and community. Just note from AOE's perspective, in some ways, the timing couldn't be worse. As you all know, the social, emotional, and mental impacts of the pandemic are still very much being felt. That said, many schools have made big investments in this area over the last few years as part of that. So my hope is that they'll have that capacity, and they have some resources for speaking with children and families about traumatic events. And we also have some of those resources available at the Vermont School Safety Center website. Just a note for families, I'm paraphrasing Deputy Secretary Terry Boucher here, which is in conversations with students about this, emphasize to the student that they're safe, that everything is all right. If help is needed, can ask for it from schools, community members, other people that you feel comfortable with. And one thing important to emphasize is if parents feel that their student wants to talk about it, they should have that conversation, even if it's difficult or uncomfortable, and not try to hold it off or whatever. If a student wants to talk about it, even if it's going to be difficult, or even if they can't express what they're feeling, that is helpful. The last thing I'll just say is we're still early in this incident. We know from experience with other states that this has happened, in that this can sometimes occur over a couple of days. So we could receive, my information is all from 11 a.m. and to my knowledge, as of an hour ago, when I came down to give these updates, we had not received any more, but it's possible that we could receive some this afternoon, or we could receive some more tomorrow. So it's just, we're all being extra vigilant right now, excuse me. We're still early in the investigative process, so I'm sure we'll give you an update in terms of what is going on. I have the list of schools as of 11 a.m. if you're interested.
I read them, but I think it would be.
I have a few copies as well I can provide.
Senator Pruitt.
Oh, yeah, I had a few questions. One was just, was there a common denominator between all of these schools? That was the first one. Or does it seem kind of random? And the second one was, did schools actively go into lockdown, or was it determined to be a hoax before they actually did that?
I don't know in all cases. I know, and I'm trying to keep it to the facts that we, as in the state, know. I have heard some anecdotes about lockdowns or community notifications in some cases, or family notifications in some cases. I don't want to say that happened everywhere. We also heard, the media did ask about whether or not schools were communicated with actively during the response. Remember, this was a call to law enforcement. And we know that that happened in some cases by anecdote. We don't know if it happened all the time. And again, this sort of underscores the recommendations that we have, and through the School Safety Center, for schools to build strong relationships with their local law enforcement. It's very possible they received calls as part of, that's because it's part of their operational plan or whatever. And that's something that I was asked by your colleagues in the House, and we can look into it and see sort of, was that a factor in terms of, was there communication before a police car showed up in the parking lot, for example. To your other question in terms of common denominator, I'm going to try to paraphrase Commissioner Morrison and say that that's still being investigated. That and some of the technical aspects of things, the messages were similar, whether it was the same message, those kind of things are what they're looking into, and we don't have an answer yet for those things, but I imagine that we will at some point be able to provide that update. So,
any indications that these threats were occurring simultaneously or near simultaneously in other states?
From what we know, and as of when we asked, which was this morning, it doesn't appear that any other New England states have this. Okay. The answer, as far as the whole country goes, is we don't know. Okay. What we do know, and I should note, and I didn't mention it earlier, what we do know is that this is unfortunately a national trend. We were made aware through our colleagues in the Department of Public Safety, and with, it's this, as you know well from taking testimony, it's AOE, DPS, and the School Safety Center is sort of bridge between. We sent out a notification most recently in December about this to superintendents to make them aware that this was unfortunately something that happens, and that was as a result of information received by the Vermont Intelligence Center, which is a unit of DPS responsible for information sharing among law enforcement, and they had received notice from other states that this happened. So even if it didn't happen simultaneously, we know it's happening in other states, to schools and to other places in the community, frankly. The term that was used earlier that I didn't include in my remarks is swatting. If you're not familiar with the term, it comes from this term SWAT team, like SWAT team. And I guess there are people who think it is amusing to call the police and get a heavily armed, thus the SWAT team terminology, police response to an unsuspecting person at an unsuspecting address. Apparently this is, I think, originally started as some sort of online joke. It's not funny, particularly when it gets used among the community, and as a way to attack schools and attack communities and spread fear. But it does appear to be sort of, unfortunately, a trend that we're seeing nationally, not just among school districts. So
has have any other states been able, when this happens, to track the people, the organization, whatever?
I don't know the answer to that.
Pretty sophisticated.
Colonel Birmingham had an interesting response earlier in the press conference. I think it was about closer to the end. If you're interested in here, I'll try my best to paraphrase here. In some cases, these incidents are still under investigation in other states. In some cases, unfortunately, it appears that the actors reside outside the United States and have, I mean, I don't want to speculate about I have my own beliefs about what their motives might be to attack communities in the United States, but it could be any number of people. And those would be difficult. I think sometimes they can be difficult to find who it was, due to the ability to use the internet and technology to make these kind of calls. There was
Commissioner
some
said during their comments, please go ahead. Finish.
No, I think you were about to say maybe the same thing I was saying, which is that there's a regulatory conversation to be had, and potentially I assume at the federal level about whether or not we can receive it's right for us to continue to be able to receive these kind of calls that are made through the internet, through phone spoofing, whatever. I mean, I don't know, and I'm way over my skis here to say whether it was the same as like what you might get from a telemarketer or something, these kind of reported calls. But my understanding is that kind of technology could be employed in situations like that. And we like presume we'll wait for the investigation to pan out as to whether or not that was the type of thing used.
My comment or question was when the commissioner referred to this as an act of terrorism, because you are putting fear into people and creating disorder. Is that a word, is that somehow connected to anything in statute or anything that allows all of a sudden the feds to help support these investigations? Or
that's a good question for DPS, and probably a good question for once they're a little further along in the investigation. But the commissioner did mention that I'm just maybe to take one more step back, is this is a criminal act. Right. There are terrorism statutes, certainly, that this could potentially fall under, but it's also a crime to make threats of this nature, threats of violence. I think once we know more, we might know whether or not. But certainly I think the term terror is apt in this case. It creates anxiety and provokes fear among members of the community. And even when there is no incident, it still has an impact, right? There's no physical threat.
Yeah.
It still is a threat that causes an impact for families and students and staff who are just trying to go to school on a Wednesday.
Other questions for Mr. Fisher? I think it would be helpful for this committee to stay in touch with the agency on this. We have a school safety bill before us. Are there lessons learned? Are there things that either the commissioner, the chief, secretary, and if you find out in the days that, the next few days, that would impact this bill and what we decide to move forward with. So if we could get let's say a regular briefing for the next next week. In other words, something, if it makes sense for Friday for you to come in for 20 minutes, that would be great. If not, next week in some kind of debrief around lessons learned, things that we might take from this, and as we build our school safety.
Absolutely. I would be happy to come and provide an update. One of the I didn't say this, but one of the thoughts for me internally is to keep a fire, understanding you have a school safety policy work in front of you at the moment, is to keep a firewall between that, because this is too important, right? This is an urgent event. This requires our full attention.
Absolutely.
But I think we can provide both an update, and I think it would be interesting for us to provide you exactly what you're just alluding to, which is say, how does this apply to the policy angle that's under consideration? And so I will communicate that back. I know that Secretary French is anxious to return to speak to you more about policy as well. So
and of course, I should preface my comments with, in no way will he be taking anybody away from this kind of important work that you're doing. So when it makes sense, when you feel it's when everybody's comfortable to return to the policy.
We can certainly give an update, and I know that it's a team effort. So many folks are working on this right now, and I'm sure our DPS colleagues will have some information for us in the coming days and weeks to share. So I appreciate the committee's time.
Anything else? Okay. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, committee, we, in any moment, I think, even maybe when Mr. Fisher opens the door, we might have our additional guests out there. You want to check who's on this one, if you want to let that person in.
There's an empty hallway.
All right.
I can leave the door open.
Oh, yeah. Why don't we